I was still exhausted from 3 sleepless nights when she said it, still recovering from the emergency C-section that had saved both my life and my daughter's, still trying to process the whirlwind of becoming a mother for the first time. Though my pain medication made everything feel foggy, but those words cut through the haze like a knife. I was sitting in my living room in our small apartment in Cedar Falls, Iowa, holding my 2-week-old daughter Aria against my chest, when my mother-in-law, Vivienne, looked directly at me and said, "That baby isn't my grandchild. She doesn't belong to this family." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Just like that. Cold, final. Like she was discussing the weather. Felt my breath catch in my throat. My arms instinctively tightened around little Aria, who was sleeping peacefully, completely unaware that someone was questioning her very existence in our family. The words hung in the air like poison, and I could feel my husband Marcus freeze beside me on the couch. He had been gently stroking Aria's tiny hand, marveling at her perfect little fingers, but now his entire body went rigid. "Mom, what are you talking about?" Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper, like he was afraid to hear the answer. Vivienne stood there in our cramped living room, perfectly dressed as always in her designer blazer and pearl earrings, looking completely out of place among our secondhand furniture and baby gear scattered everywhere. She clutched her expensive handbag like a shield and looked down at us with those cold blue eyes that had made me feel unwelcome from the very first day I met her 3 years ago. "Look at her, Marcus," Vivienne said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Really look at her. She doesn't look like you. She doesn't look like anyone in our family. Those dark eyes, that olive skin tone, that black hair. You have blonde hair and blue eyes, just like your father and me, just like your sister Claire. This child?" She paused, gesturing dismissively toward my baby. "This child looks nothing like a Hartwell." I felt like I'd been slapped. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure everyone in the room could hear it. I looked down at Aria's beautiful face, her smooth caramel-colored skin, her thick dark lashes, her tiny rosebud lips. She was perfect. She was mine. She was ours. How could anyone look at this innocent baby and see anything but pure love? "She's beautiful," I managed to whisper, my voice shaking. "She's our daughter." Vivienne let out a bitter laugh that made my skin crawl. "Is she, though? Because from where I'm standing, Isabella, it looks like you've been lying to my son. That baby is clearly not his biological child." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. I felt dizzy, nauseous, like the room was spinning around me. Marcus jumped to his feet so fast he nearly knocked over the coffee table. "That's enough," he shouted, but his voice cracked, and I could hear the uncertainty creeping in. "Mom, you can't just come into our home and—" "I can and I will," Vivienne interrupted, her voice growing stronger, more confident. "I've raised 2 children, Marcus. I know what genetics look like. I know what family resemblance means. And that baby—" She pointed directly at Aria again. "That baby is not a Hartwell, which means either you're not the father or your wife has some explaining to do." I felt tears burning behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not in front of her. Not when she was attacking my integrity, my marriage, my beautiful daughter. I had been with Marcus for 3 years. We'd been married for 18 months. I had never, not once, been unfaithful to him. The suggestion was so absurd, so hurtful, that I couldn't even find words to defend myself. "Get out," I said quietly, still holding Aria close to my chest. "Get out of our home." "Oh, I'll leave," Vivienne said, moving toward the door. "But this conversation isn't over. I won't stand by and watch my son be deceived. I won't let him raise another man's child thinking it's his own. There are ways to prove these things now, you know. DNA tests. Simple, accurate, undeniable." She turned back to face us one more time before leaving, her eyes fixed on Marcus. "When you're ready to face the truth, son, call me. But until then, don't expect me to pretend that child is my grandchild. The Hartwell family has standards, and we don't claim children who don't belong to us." The door slammed behind her, leaving us in stunned silence. Aria stirred in my arms, making a small whimpering sound, and I realized I was shaking. My whole body was trembling with rage, hurt, and disbelief. Marcus stood frozen in the middle of our living room, staring at the door where his mother had just exited, his face pale and confused. This was supposed to be the happiest time of our lives. We had just brought our first child home from the hospital after a difficult pregnancy and traumatic delivery. I had almost died from complications during the emergency surgery. We should have been celebrating, bonding as a new family, enjoying those precious first weeks with our newborn daughter. Instead, my mother-in-law had just accused me of adultery and disowned my baby. But what I didn't know in that moment, what none of us could have predicted, was that 3 weeks later, a simple DNA test would arrive in our mailbox and change everything. Not in the way Vivienne expected, but in a way that would expose family secrets that had been buried for over 25 years. The truth would vindicate me completely, but it would also shatter the Hartwell family's perfect image forever. This is the story of how my mother-in-law's cruelty backfired in the most spectacular way possible. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That baby isn't my grandchild. She doesn't belong to this family. Those words kept echoing in my head long after Vivienne had stormed out of our apartment. I sat there in the sudden silence, holding Aria close, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. Marcus was still standing in the middle of our living room, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, staring at the door his mother had just slammed. "She can't be serious," he finally said, but his voice was hollow, uncertain. He turned to look at me, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw doubt creeping into his eyes. Not doubt about me, exactly, but doubt about everything. About his family. About what he thought he knew. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw something. Instead, I just held our daughter tighter and tried to process what had just happened. Vivienne Hartwell, the woman who had made my life difficult from day one, had just accused me of cheating on her son and claimed that my newborn baby wasn't his child. In our own home. While I was still recovering from surgery. While our daughter was sleeping peacefully in my arms. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. "Marcus," I said quietly, my voice barely steady, "you know that's not true. You know I would never—" "I know," he said quickly, moving back to the couch and sitting down beside me. But he didn't meet my eyes. "I know you wouldn't. It's just—" "She's never said anything like that before. She's been difficult, yes, but this is insane," I finished for him. "This is insane." But even as I said it, I could see the wheels turning in his head. I could see him studying Aria's face, looking for resemblances, searching for proof of his own paternity. And that hurt almost as much as his mother's accusations. That my own husband, the man who had held my hand through 36 hours of labor complications, who had been there for every doctor's appointment, every ultrasound, was now silently questioning whether this baby was his. Aria opened her eyes then, those beautiful dark brown eyes that Vivienne had used as evidence against me. She looked up at me with that unfocused newborn gaze, completely trusting, completely innocent. She had no idea that her very existence was being questioned, that her place in this family was being challenged before she was even 3 weeks old. "Does look different," Marcus said softly, and I felt my heart break a little. "She looks like me," I said firmly. "She has my eyes, my skin tone, my hair color. That doesn't mean she's not yours, Marcus. Genetics don't work the way your mother thinks they do. But I could see the seed of doubt that Vivienne had planted taking root. Marcus loved me, I knew that. But he also loved his family, despite their flaws. And his mother had a way of getting inside his head, of making him question his own judgment. She'd been doing it his whole life. Maybe we should... He started, then stopped. Should what? Maybe we should get a test, just to put this to rest, to prove her wrong. I stared at him in disbelief. You want to get a paternity test? On our daughter? Because your mother doesn't think she looks enough like you? It's not that I don't trust you, he said quickly. It's just, if we get the test and it proves she's mine, then my mother will have to apologize. She'll have to accept Aria. We'll have concrete proof. The fact that he thought we needed concrete proof was devastating. But I also understood his position. Vivienne had been questioning his judgment his entire life, making him feel like he couldn't trust his own instincts. And now she was questioning the legitimacy of his own child. Fine, I said, hating every word that came out of my mouth. If that's what it takes to protect our daughter from your mother's accusations, then fine. We'll get the test. Marcus looked relieved, which made me feel even worse. But what choice did I have? If I refused, it would only fuel Vivienne's suspicions. If I agreed, at least we could put this nightmare to rest and prove once and for all that Aria was exactly who we knew she was, our daughter. I'll call the lab tomorrow, Marcus said. It's just a simple cheek swab. We'll have results in a few days. A few days. A few days of living under this cloud of suspicion, of having our daughter's legitimacy questioned, of feeling like strangers in our own family. A few days of wondering if Marcus would look at Aria differently every time he held her. That night, I lay awake listening to Aria's soft breathing in her bassinet beside our bed. Marcus was asleep, or pretending to be, but I could feel the tension radiating from his body. Everything had changed in the span of one cruel conversation. Our joy had been tainted. Our trust had been shaken. Our family had been fractured, and all because Vivienne Hartwell couldn't stand the idea that her son had married someone who didn't fit her narrow definition of what a Hartwell wife should be. Someone who didn't come from the right family, the right background, the right social circle. Someone whose baby didn't look exactly like the other blonde-haired, blue-eyed Hartwells. But what Vivienne didn't know, what none of us knew at that moment, was that the DNA test she was so eager for would reveal truths that would destroy her carefully constructed family image forever. The test would prove Aria's paternity beyond any doubt, but it would also expose secrets that had been hidden for decades. Sometimes when you throw stones, they don't land where you expect them to. Sometimes they shatter the very foundation you're standing on. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I was drowning. The events of the previous day crashed over me like a wave, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I lay there in bed, listening to Marcus moving around in the kitchen, the sound of coffee brewing, the gentle clink of dishes. Normal sounds, domestic sounds, but nothing felt normal anymore. Aria was still sleeping in her bassinet, her tiny chest, rising and falling with each peaceful breath. I reached over and touched her soft cheek, and she instinctively turned toward my finger, her lips making small sucking motions. Such a natural, innocent response. How could anyone look at this perfect baby and see anything but love? But as I watched her sleep, Vivienne's words kept playing on repeat in my mind. That baby isn't my grandchild. She doesn't belong to this family. The venom in her voice, the absolute certainty with which she'd delivered her verdict. As if she had the right to decide who belonged and who didn't. As if she was some kind of family gatekeeper with the power to cast people out. I felt completely helpless. Not just sad or angry, but truly, deeply powerless. Here I was, a new mother who should have been glowing with happiness, instead lying in bed feeling like I'd been erased from my own story. My identity as Marcus's wife, as Aria's mother, as a member of the Hartwell family, had all been called into question with a few cruel sentences. The worst part wasn't even Vivienne's accusation. The worst part was the look in Marcus's eyes afterward. That flicker of uncertainty. The way he'd studied Aria's face like he was seeing her for the first time. The way he'd suggested the DNA test, as if my word wasn't enough. As if 3 years of marriage and complete faithfulness meant nothing in the face of his mother's suspicions. I heard his footsteps approaching the bedroom, and I quickly wiped the tears from my cheeks, trying to compose myself. He appeared in the doorway holding 2 cups of coffee, still in his pajamas, his blonde hair sticking up at odd angles. "How did you sleep?" he asked softly, setting my coffee on the nightstand. "I didn't," I admitted. There was no point in lying. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked down at Aria, who was starting to stir. "She's beautiful, Izzy. She's perfect." "But she doesn't look like you," I said, unable to keep the bitterness out of my voice. Marcus flinched. "That's not what I meant." "Isn't it, though? Isn't that exactly what this is about? The fact that she has dark hair and brown eyes instead of blonde hair and blue eyes? The fact that she looks like me instead of looking like a Hartwell?" He was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him struggling with his thoughts. "My mother has always been particular about family, about bloodlines, about maintaining certain standards." Standards? The word came out louder than I intended, and Aria startled slightly. I lowered my voice. "What kind of standards, Marcus? The kind where babies have to pass some sort of appearance test to be considered legitimate family members. You know that's not fair." "What's not fair is your mother coming into our home and accusing me of adultery. What's not fair is her looking at our 2-week-old daughter and declaring that she doesn't belong. What's not fair is you even considering for 1 second that she might be right." Marcus set down his coffee cup with shaking hands. "I don't think she's right. I know you would never cheat on me. But Izzy, you have to understand. My mother, she's never been wrong about family things before. She has this intuition about people, about relationships. When my cousin brought home his first girlfriend, my mother said she wasn't right for our family. They broke up 6 months later. When my sister started dating her ex-husband, my mother said he was hiding something. Turns out he was already married. I stared at him in disbelief. "So you're saying your mother has some kind of supernatural ability to detect family authenticity? That she can look at a baby and determine paternity through intuition?" "That's not what I'm saying." "Then what are you saying, Marcus? Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you're defending her. It sounds like you think there might be some validity to her concerns." He ran his hands through his hair, looking frustrated and conflicted. "I just want to protect our family. I want to protect you and Aria. If we get the test and it proves she's mine, then my mother will have to back down. She'll have to apologize. We'll have peace. And if I refuse the test? What then? Will you always wonder? Will you look at Aria differently every time she does something that doesn't remind you of yourself?" The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. I could hear the neighbors upstairs walking around, the sound of traffic outside our window. Normal life continuing around us while our world fell apart. "I called the lab this morning," Marcus said finally. "They can see us this afternoon." I felt something inside me break. Not snap dramatically, but just quietly crumble, like sand running through fingers. My husband had made an appointment to test whether our daughter was actually his child, without discussing it with me first, without asking if I was ready. He'd just decided, probably while I was lying here drowning in my own thoughts, that this was the best course of action. "Fine," I whispered, because what else could I say? If I fought him on this, I would look guilty. If I refused, it would only fuel Vivienne's suspicions and create more doubt in Marcus's mind. I was trapped in a situation where the only way to prove my innocence was to submit to a test that implied I might be guilty. Aria started crying then, a soft mewling sound that meant she was hungry. I picked her up and held her against my chest, feeling her tiny heart beating against mine. She rooted around, searching for comfort, trusting completely that I would provide what she needed. "I'm sorry," Marcus said quietly. "I know this is hard. I know it hurts. But once we have the results, this will all be over." But I knew it wouldn't be over. Even after the test proved what I already knew to be true, something fundamental had shifted in our relationship. Trust, once broken, doesn't just magically repair itself with a piece of paper. And Vivienne would find other ways to make me feel unwelcome, other reasons to question my place in their family. What I didn't know was that the test results would change everything in ways none of us could imagine. The DNA wouldn't just prove Aria's paternity. It would unravel secrets that had been carefully hidden for decades, secrets that would make Vivienne's accusations look like the desperate deflection they truly were. I never expected to fall in love with Marcus Hartwell. When I first met him at Northwestern University during my junior year, he seemed like everything I wasn't. He was studying business administration with plans to join his family's investment firm in Evanston. I was majoring in social work, planning to help underprivileged families in Chicago. He came from old money, country clubs, and summer houses in Lake Geneva. I came from a single mother who worked 3 jobs to put me through college and a tiny apartment above a bakery in Little Village. But Marcus was different from what I expected. He was kind, genuinely interested in my studies, and seemed fascinated by my stories about growing up in a working-class Latino family. When other guys at parties would dismiss my opinions or talk over me, Marcus would listen intently and ask thoughtful questions. He never made me feel small or insignificant, which was more than I could say for most people in his social circle. We started dating in October of my junior year. By Christmas, I knew I was in love with him. By Valentine's Day, he'd told me he wanted to marry me someday. Everything felt perfect, natural, right, until I met his family. The first time Marcus brought me home to their sprawling colonial mansion in Winnetka was during spring break. I remember standing in their circular driveway, looking up at the house with its perfectly manicured gardens and thinking I'd accidentally wandered onto a movie set. Everything was so pristine, so carefully orchestrated, so far removed from anything I'd ever experienced. Vivienne Hartwell greeted us at the front door wearing a cream-colored cashmere sweater and pearls. She was beautiful in that untouchable way that only comes with generations of privilege and professional maintenance. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, her smile polite but cold. "You must be Isabella," she said, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "Marcus has told us so much about you." But even as she said the words, I could see her taking inventory. My clearance rack dress from Target, my secondhand shoes, my nervous smile. I watched her eyes catalog every detail, filing them away under "not quite suitable." Dinner that first night was an exercise in subtle humiliation. Vivienne asked about my family, my background, my people, as she put it. When I mentioned that my mother was a housekeeper and my father had left when I was 12, I saw something flicker across her face. Not sympathy. Assessment. "How interesting," she said in that tone that meant exactly the opposite. "And what does your mother think about you dating Marcus?" The question was loaded, designed to highlight the differences between our families. My mother, who barely spoke English and cleaned other people's houses for a living, versus their mother, who sat on charity boards and had never worked a day in her life. "She thinks he's wonderful," I answered truthfully. "She says he makes me happy, and that's all that matters to her." Vivienne smiled that cold smile again. How refreshing. Such a simple way of looking at things. Marcus either didn't notice the undercurrents or chose to ignore them. He was excited to show me off to his family, proud to introduce me to his world. But I felt like an intruder the entire weekend, like I was being tested and found wanting at every turn. His father, Richard, was more direct in his disapproval. During Sunday brunch, he asked about my career plans. Social work, I said. I want to help families in crisis, particularly immigrant families who are struggling to navigate the system. He raised an eyebrow. Not much money in that field is there? It's not about the money, I replied. It's about making a difference. Admirable, he said, but his tone suggested he found it naive rather than noble. Of course, when you're part of this family, you'll find that your perspective on these things might evolve. The assumption that I would abandon my values, my career goals, my identity to fit into their world was breathtaking. But Marcus squeezed my hand under the table and smiled at me, and I told myself that his love would be enough, that I could weather his family's disapproval as long as he stood. By me after graduation, Marcus proposed. It was beautiful, romantic, everything I'd ever dreamed of. But the engagement period was a nightmare. Vivienne inserted herself into every aspect of our wedding planning, from the venue to the guest list to my dress. She had opinions about everything, and wasn't shy about sharing them. "Are you sure you want such a bold color scheme?" she asked when I showed her my ideas for burgundy and gold decorations. "Perhaps something more traditional? More classic?" When I wanted to include some of my family's Mexican traditions in the ceremony, she looked physically pained. "I suppose we could incorporate some cultural elements, as long as they don't overwhelm the more traditional aspects." Every conversation was a negotiation, every decision a battle. Marcus tried to mediate, but he was caught in the middle, wanting to please both his mother and his fiancée. Looking back, I can see that this was Vivienne's strategy all along. Wear me down, make me feel like an outsider, force me to constantly justify my place in their family. The wedding itself was beautiful, but felt more like Vivienne's event than mine. Half the guests were her friends and business associates. The country club venue was her choice. Even my wedding dress had been refined according to her suggestions, until it looked nothing like what I'd originally envisioned. But I got through it because I loved Marcus, and I believed that once we were married, once we had our own home, and our own life, things would be different. I thought Vivienne would eventually warm up to me, or at least learn to tolerate me. I was wrong. The first year of marriage was a constant struggle for territory. Vivienne would drop by our apartment, unannounced, rearrange things to her liking, and leave passive-aggressive notes about how we could improve our living situation. She critiqued my cooking, my decorating choices, my career. She made it clear that in her opinion, I wasn't good enough for her son and never would be. When we announced that we were trying to have a baby, I thought maybe motherhood would finally earn me a place in the family. I thought giving Vivienne her first grandchild would bridge the gap between us. Instead, it gave her a new weapon to use against me. And now, sitting in our living room holding that perfect baby, while my husband made appointments to prove I hadn't cheated on him, I realized that no amount of love, no genetic test, no proof of my worthiness would ever be enough for Vivienne Hartwell. But what I didn't know was that the DNA test she was pushing for would reveal that the Hartwell family's perfect image was built on lies that went back decades. And those lies were about to destroy everything Vivienne held dear. The pregnancy hadn't been the joyful experience I'd dreamed of since childhood. From the moment I saw those 2 pink lines on the test, complications seemed to follow me like a shadow. What should have been 9 months of anticipation and bonding with my growing baby became a medical obstacle course that left me exhausted, scared, and increasingly isolated. It started at 8 weeks with severe morning sickness that lasted all day. I couldn't keep food down for weeks, lost 12 pounds, and ended up in the emergency room twice for dehydration. My doctor, Dr. Sarah Chen, put me on anti-nausea medication and ordered bed rest, which meant taking leave from my job at the community center where I counseled immigrant families. Marcus tried to be supportive, but his work at Hartwell Investments demanded long hours and frequent travel. When he was home, he'd rub my back and bring me crackers and ginger tea, but I could see the worry in his eyes. This wasn't the glowing, radiant pregnancy experience either of us had imagined. Vivienne, predictably, had opinions about everything. She'd sweep into our apartment with shopping bags full of organic foods and expensive prenatal vitamins, criticizing everything from my doctor's approach to my negative attitude. When I was pregnant with Marcus and Claire, I never missed a day of tennis, she'd announce while reorganizing our kitchen cabinets. Mind over matter, Isabella. These modern women make such a production out of natural biological processes. She seemed to take my pregnancy complications as a personal affront, as if my body's inability to handle pregnancy gracefully was yet another sign of my inadequacy as a potential Hartwell mother. When I mentioned that my own mother had similar issues during her pregnancies, Vivienne's response was swift and cutting. Well, that explains it then. Poor genetics. We should have expected as much. The comment hit me like a physical blow. Poor genetics. As if my DNA was somehow inferior, faulty, not good enough to successfully carry a Hartwell grandchild. I started to wonder if she was hoping I'd miscarry, if that would solve what she clearly saw as the problem of me being permanently tied to her family. At 22 weeks, just when I thought things might be stabilizing, I started having contractions. Dr. Chen immediately put me on strict bed rest and prescribed medication to stop the premature labor. For 2 terrifying weeks, I lived in constant fear that I would lose the baby. Marcus worked from home during that period, but the stress was affecting him too. I could see him watching me constantly, afraid to leave me alone, afraid that something terrible would happen while he was gone. Vivienne's response to this crisis was to move into our guest room to help. But her version of help felt more like surveillance. She monitored everything I ate, timed my medication doses, and kept detailed logs of my symptoms that she'd present to Marcus each evening, like evidence of my body's failures. "She's not following the bed rest instructions properly," she'd report. "I caught her in the kitchen making herself lunch instead of calling for help. She's not taking this seriously enough." The constant scrutiny made me feel like a prisoner, in my own home. I couldn't even go to the bathroom without Vivienne noting the time and duration in her little notebook. When I complained to Marcus, he was caught between wanting to support me and not wanting to upset his mother during what everyone kept calling this delicate time. "She means well," he'd say, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. "She's just worried about you and the baby." But it didn't feel like worry. It felt like judgment. Like she was documenting my failures as a pregnant woman, building a case for why I wasn't suitable to carry a Hartwell child. The isolation was almost worse than the physical symptoms. My friends from work couldn't visit often because of the bed rest restrictions. My mother, who lived an hour away in the city and didn't drive, could only come on weekends when Marcus could pick her up. Most days, it was just me, Vivienne, and the growing tension between us. At 32 weeks, during what was supposed to be a routine checkup, Dr. Chen discovered that my blood pressure was dangerously high. I was immediately admitted to Riverside General Hospital and put on medication to prevent seizures. The diagnosis was severe preeclampsia, and there was a real possibility that the baby would need to be delivered early to save both our lives. I spent 3 weeks in the hospital, hooked up to monitors, receiving steroid injections to help the baby's lungs develop faster and living with the constant fear that my body was failing both of us. Marcus visited every day after work, but he looked exhausted and overwhelmed. Vivienne came too, of course, armed with medical articles she'd printed from the internet and opinions about the hospital's treatment plan. "I've been researching your condition," she announced during one visit, pulling out a thick folder. "Did you know that preeclampsia is more common in women with certain backgrounds? Poor nutrition during childhood, genetic predispositions, inadequate prenatal care. It's really quite preventable with the right lifestyle choices." Even while I was lying in a hospital bed, fighting to keep my baby alive, She couldn't resist the opportunity to suggest that this was somehow my fault, that my genetics, my upbringing, my choices had caused this crisis. The worst part was the uncertainty. Every day brought new tests, new concerns, new possibilities for disaster. The doctors explained that if my condition worsened, they'd have to deliver the baby immediately, regardless of whether her lungs were fully developed. I spent sleepless nights with my hands on my belly, talking to my daughter, begging her to hold on just a little longer, promising her that everything would be okay, even though I wasn't sure it would be. Marcus started staying overnight in the hospital during my final week there, sleeping in the uncomfortable chair beside my bed. I could see the toll this was taking on him, the way he'd flinch every time a monitor beeped or a nurse rushed into the room. This wasn't how either of us had imagined becoming parents. At 35 weeks, my blood pressure spiked to dangerous levels during the night. The decision was made to deliver immediately via emergency C-section. As they wheeled me into the operating room, with Marcus running alongside the gurney in surgical scrubs, I remember thinking that after everything we'd been through, all I wanted was for our baby to be healthy and safe. I never imagined that once she arrived, someone would question whether she was even ours. The waiting room at Precision Genetics Lab felt like a courtroom where I was already guilty until proven innocent. The sterile white walls and fluorescent lighting made everything feel cold and clinical, which somehow made this whole ordeal even more humiliating. I sat in one of those uncomfortable plastic chairs, holding Aria against my chest, while Marcus paced nervously by the reception desk. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was here to prove my daughter's legitimacy to a woman who had spent 3 years trying to prove I didn't belong in her family. Vivienne had made it clear that she expected to be present for the DNA collection, arriving at the lab 15 minutes before our appointment in a crisp navy suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary. "I want to make sure the process is handled correctly," she announced to the receptionist, as if the lab technicians couldn't be trusted to do their jobs without her supervision. "This is a very important matter for our family." Our family. As if I wasn't sitting right there. As if Aria and I were just problems to be solved rather than people to be loved. Marcus signed the paperwork with shaking hands while I tried to ignore the way Vivienne kept staring at Aria with those calculating blue eyes. She wasn't looking at her granddaughter with love or curiosity. She was studying her like a puzzle she was determined to solve, cataloging every feature that didn't match her preconceived notions of what a Hartwell baby should look like. "Mrs. Hartwell," the lab technician called, and for a moment, both Vivienne and I responded. The technician, a young woman with kind eyes named Stephanie, looked confused. "Isabella Hartwell," I clarified, standing up with Aria. "I'm the mother." "Of course," Stephanie said with a professional smile. "And Mr. Hartwell. We'll need samples from both parents and the child." As we followed her into the collection room, Vivienne tried to come with us. "I'm sorry," Stephanie said politely but firmly. "Only the immediate family members providing samples are allowed in the collection room. It's lab policy." Vivienne's face flushed with indignation. "I'm the grandmother. I have every right to—" "Actually, you don't," I said, finding my voice. For the first time since this nightmare began. "You have no legal right to be involved in this process at all." The words hung in the air between us, sharp and clear. Marcus looked surprised by my sudden assertiveness, but I was tired of being treated like a criminal in my own life. If we were going to do this humiliating test, at least I could maintain some dignity in the process. Vivienne's eyes narrowed. "We'll see about that once the results come back." The sample collection itself was quick and painless. Stephanie swabbed. The inside of Marcus's cheek first, then mine, then gently swabbed Aria's tiny mouth while she slept peacefully in my arms. 3 simple cotton swabs that would apparently determine our family's future. "Results will be available in 5 to 7 business days," Stephanie explained as she labeled the samples. "We'll call when they're ready, and you can either pick them up in person or have them mailed to your address." We'll pick them up, Vivienne interjected from the doorway, where she'd been lurking despite being told to wait outside. Actually, I said firmly, they'll be mailed to our home address. This is between Marcus and me. Vivienne's mouth tightened into a thin line, but she didn't argue. Not there anyway. She waited until we were in the parking lot to launch her next attack. I hope you understand the gravity of what's happening here, Isabella, she said, adjusting her designer handbag on her shoulder. If this test proves what I suspect it will prove, there will be consequences. Legal consequences. Financial consequences. Marcus won't be responsible for supporting another man's child. The threat was delivered in that same calm, measured tone. She'd used to criticize my cooking and my career choices. But this was different. This was her threatening to destroy my life, my marriage, my family if the test didn't go the way she wanted. And if the test proves that Aria is Marcus's daughter? I asked. What then? Will you apologize? Will you finally treat us with the respect we deserve? She smiled that cold smile I'd come to hate. If the test proves that, then I suppose we'll have to examine other possibilities, genetic anomalies, lab errors. These things aren't always as straightforward as they seem. I stared at her in disbelief. She was already planning to question the results if they didn't support her narrative. There was no scenario in which she would accept Aria as her granddaughter, no amount of evidence that would convince her to welcome us into the family. Marcus, who had been quietly listening to this exchange, finally spoke up. Mom, that's enough. Isabella is my wife. Aria is our daughter. This test is just to put your concerns to rest once and for all. My concerns? Vivienne laughed, but there was no humor in it. Marcus, darling, my concerns are about protecting you from making a terrible mistake. About protecting our family's reputation and resources from someone who clearly has her own agenda. What agenda? I demanded. Loving your son? Raising our daughter? Trying to build a life together despite your constant interference? Please, she scoffed. You've been planning this from the moment you met Marcus. A poor girl from the wrong side of Chicago sees an opportunity to marry into money and social status. Getting pregnant was just the final step in securing your position. The accusation was so outrageous, so completely divorced from reality, that I actually laughed. You think I got pregnant on purpose? You think I planned to spend months in the hospital, nearly die during delivery, and then deal with your accusations? Just to… What? Get access to your money? It wouldn't be the first time a woman tried to trap a man with a pregnancy, she said coolly. Though usually they're more careful about ensuring the child actually belongs to the father. Marcus stepped between us, his face pale but determined. Stop it. Both of you. This ends now. We're going home, and we're not discussing this again until the results come back. But as we drove home in tense silence, with Aria sleeping peacefully, in her car seat and Vivienne following in her Mercedes like a predator stalking prey, I knew this wasn't going to end with the test results. Vivienne had made it clear that she would never accept me or my daughter, regardless of what the DNA test proved. What I didn't know was that the test would reveal secrets that would flip everything upside down. Secrets that would make Vivienne's accusations look like desperate deflection from her own family's lies. 6 days. We waited 6 excruciating days for the results, and every hour felt like a lifetime. The atmosphere in our apartment was suffocating, thick with unspoken doubts and carefully measured words. Marcus tried to act normal, but I could see him watching me sometimes when he thought I wasn't looking, studying my face as if searching for signs of deception he might have missed. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Vivienne's voice echoing in my head. That baby isn't my grandchild. The worst part was that a tiny, insidious voice in the back of my mind had started to whisper, what if she's right? Not about the paternity, but about me not belonging. What if I really was just fooling myself into thinking I could ever be part of their family? Aria seemed to sense the tension. She was fussier than usual, crying more often, sleeping fitfully. Even, she could feel that something was wrong in our home. I found myself talking to her during our late-night feeding sessions, whispering apologies for the chaos surrounding her birth, promising her that no matter what happened, I would protect her from the ugliness of adult conflicts. On Thursday morning, Marcus left for work earlier than usual. He'd been doing that all week, claiming he had important meetings, but I suspected he just couldn't handle the suffocating atmosphere at home. I didn't blame him. I would have escaped too if I'd had anywhere to go. I was feeding Aria in the nursery when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer it anyway. Mrs. Hartwell? This is Jennifer Morrison from Precision Genetics Lab. Your test results are ready for pickup. My heart started pounding so hard I thought it might wake Aria. Already? You said 5 to 7 days. Sometimes the processing goes faster than expected. You can come in any time today during business hours. I hung up and immediately called Marcus, but it went straight to voicemail. Of course. He was probably in one of those endless board meetings that Vivienne loved to schedule during family crises. I left a message asking him to call me back urgently, then sat in the nursery rocking chair, staring at my phone and trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to wait for Marcus to face this together as we'd planned. But another part of me, the part that had been questioned and doubted and made to feel like a criminal for the past week, wanted to get those results and end this nightmare immediately. I was still debating when my phone rang again. This time, it was a number I recognized, my mother-in-law's personal cell phone, Isabella. Vivienne's voice was crisp and businesslike. I assume you've heard from the lab. How did you? I started, then stopped. Of course she'd found a way to get the information. Vivienne Hartwell always found a way to know what she wanted to know. I've already spoken to Marcus. He's asked me to accompany you to pick up the results since he's tied up in meetings all afternoon. The lie was so smooth, so confident, that for a moment I almost believed her. But I knew Marcus would never ask his mother to handle something this personal without discussing it with me first. I'll wait for Marcus, I said firmly. Don't be ridiculous. The sooner we resolve this matter, the better for everyone involved. I'll pick you up in 20 minutes. She hung up before I could respond, leaving me staring at my phone in disbelief. The audacity was breathtaking. She was actually trying to manipulate me into getting the results with her instead of my husband, probably so she could control how the information was revealed and interpreted. I immediately tried calling Marcus again, but his phone was still going straight to voicemail. I left another message, more urgent this time, explaining what Vivienne was planning and asking him to call me back immediately. But as the minutes ticked by, I realized he probably wouldn't get my messages in time to stop her. True to her word, Vivienne arrived exactly 20 minutes later. I watched from our apartment window as her sleek black Mercedes pulled up to the curb, and I saw her checking her reflection in the rearview mirror before getting out. Even for something like this, she had to look perfect. When she knocked on our door, I didn't answer. I stood in the hallway holding Aria, hoping she would just go away. But Vivienne had never been the type to give up easily. Isabella, I know. You're in there. Open the door. We need to handle this like adults. I'm waiting for Marcus, I called through the door. Marcus is busy handling real responsibilities. This is just paperwork that needs to be collected. Don't make this more dramatic than it needs to be. I could hear the implied criticism in her tone. As usual, she was suggesting that I was being emotional and unreasonable while she was being practical and mature. It was the same dynamic that had played out hundreds of times during my marriage, and I was tired of it. But then I thought about sitting in this apartment for another few hours, waiting and worrying and letting my imagination run wild. At least if I went to the lab, I would have answers. I could end this torment once and for all. Against my better judgment, I opened the door. Vivienne was dressed as impeccably as always, in a tailored cream-colored coat and leather gloves. She looked me up and down, taking in my rumpled jeans and oversized sweater, and I saw that familiar flash of disapproval in her eyes. "Get your things," she said. "Let's get this over with." The drive to the lab was tense and silent. Vivienne kept the radio off and drove with her usual precision, her manicured hands gripping the steering wheel as she navigated through downtown Cedar Falls traffic. I sat in the passenger seat holding Aria's car seat, watching the familiar buildings pass by and wondering if this would be the moment that changed everything. At the lab, Stephanie greeted us with the same professional smile she'd worn during the sample collection. She handed me a sealed envelope with our names printed on the front in clinical black letters. "Would you like to review the results here, or would you prefer to take them with you?" she asked. "Here," Vivienne said immediately. "We'll review them here." I looked at the envelope in my hands, this small white rectangle that contained the answer to the question that had been tearing our family apart. Part of me wanted to tear it open immediately. Part of me wanted to burn it without reading it, and pretend none of this had ever happened. "Actually," I said slowly, "I think I want to wait for my husband." Vivienne's jaw tightened. "Isabella, don't be childish. We're here. The results are here. Let's just see what they say." "No." The word came out stronger than I expected. "This is between Marcus and me. You shouldn't even be here. I have every right to be here. This affects my family, my son's future, my—" "Your what?" I interrupted. "Your reputation? Your social standing? Your perfect family image?" Stephanie cleared her throat uncomfortably. "Perhaps you'd like to use one of our private consultation rooms to discuss this." Before either of us could answer, the lab's front door opened and Marcus walked in, looking harried and out of breath. He spotted us immediately and hurried over, his face flushed from running. "I got your messages," he said, slightly out of breath. "I came as soon as I could get out of the meeting. Mom, what are you doing here?" "I was helping," Vivienne said, smoothly. Isabella was too anxious to wait, so I offered to drive her. The lie was so casual, so confident, that I almost admired the skill of it. But Marcus looked at me questioningly, and I shook my head. "That's not what happened," I said. Quietly. Marcus's expression darkened as he looked between us. "Mom, I specifically asked you to let us handle this ourselves." "I was just trying to help," she repeated, but there was less conviction in her voice now. "By manipulating the situation? By trying to control how we get our own test results?" The first time since I'd known her, Vivienne looked genuinely flustered. She wasn't used to being called out so directly by her son, especially not in public. Stephanie, clearly uncomfortable with the family drama playing out in her reception area, gestured toward a private room. "Why don't we step in here so you can review the results privately?" We followed her into a small consultation room with a round table and 4 chairs. I sat down with Aria still in her car seat beside me, while Marcus took the chair next to me, and Vivienne sat across from us, her posture rigid and defensive. "Take your time," Stephanie said, closing the door behind her as she left. I looked down at the envelope again, then at Marcus. "Are you ready for this?" He nodded, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands were clenched in his lap. Despite everything, despite his support and his love, there was still a part of him that was nervous about what we might find. Vivienne had planted seeds of doubt so deep that even he couldn't completely ignore them. I tore open the envelope and pulled out the official report. The technical language was dense and complicated, full of scientific terms and statistical probabilities. But there, in the summary section, in clear, unambiguous language, was the answer we'd been waiting for. The alleged father, Marcus James Hartwell, is not excluded as the biological father of the tested child, Aria Rose Hartwell. The probability of paternity is 99.9%. I read the words twice to make sure I understood them correctly. Then I handed the report to Marcus, watching his face as he scanned the results. Relief flooded his features, followed immediately by something that looked like shame. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, reaching for my hand. "I'm so sorry I ever doubted you." But Vivienne wasn't ready to accept defeat. She leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the report. "Let me see that." Marcus handed her the paper reluctantly. She studied it for a long moment, her brow furrowed in concentration. "This doesn't make sense," she said finally. "There must be some mistake. Labs make errors all the time. We should get a second opinion, use a different facility." "Mom," Marcus said firmly, "it's over. Aria is my daughter. Isabella never cheated on me. You were wrong." But Vivienne was shaking her head, her perfectly styled hair coming slightly undone for the first time since I'd known her. "No, there's something else going on here. Something we're not seeing. This child does not look like a Hartwell. She can't be." She trailed off, staring at the report with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger or disapproval, but something that looked almost like fear. "She can't be what?" I asked. Vivienne's face had gone pale beneath her expertly applied makeup. Her hands were trembling slightly as she set the report down on the table. "This is impossible," she whispered. "What's impossible?" Marcus asked. "The test proves Aria is mine." Case closed. But Vivienne was shaking her head again, more vigorously this time. "You don't understand. If she's really your daughter, if these results are accurate, then—" She stopped, her eyes wide with what looked like panic. "Then what?" I demanded. Vivienne stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I need to make some phone calls. I need to— There are things you don't understand. Family things. Complicated things." She was backing toward the door now, clutching her handbag like a lifeline. "Don't tell anyone about these results yet. Not until we can figure out what this means." What means? Marcus was on his feet now too, confused and increasingly alarmed by his mother's behavior. "Mom, you're not making sense." But Vivienne was already at the door, her hand on the handle. "I have to go. I have to check some things. Don't discuss this with anyone. Not your father, not Claire, not anyone. Promise me." She didn't wait for an answer. She rushed out of the consultation room, leaving the three of us staring after her in bewilderment. Through the window, I watched her hurry to her car, fumbling with her keys like someone running from a crime scene. "What just happened?" I asked, looking at Marcus for answers he clearly didn't have. He was staring at the door where his mother had disappeared, the paternity report still in his hand. "I have no idea, but I've never seen her act like that before." She looked scared. As we drove home in our own car, with the DNA results safely tucked in my purse and Aria sleeping peacefully in her car seat, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd just witnessed something significant. Vivienne's reaction didn't make sense. The test had proven exactly what I'd known all along, that Aria was Marcus's daughter. But instead of apologizing or admitting she was wrong, Vivienne had seemed terrified by the results. What family secrets could be so dark that proof of Aria's paternity would threaten them? And why did I have the growing suspicion that we were about to find out? For 3 days after the lab incident, Vivienne disappeared. No phone calls, no unexpected visits, no passive-aggressive text messages about family obligations. It was the longest stretch of peace Marcus and I had experienced since our wedding, but instead of relief, I felt a growing sense of unease. Vivienne's reaction to the DNA results had been so bizarre, so out of character, that I couldn't stop thinking about it. She looked terrified, I told Marcus for the 100th time as we sat on our couch Saturday evening, watching Aria sleep in her bouncer. Not angry, not embarrassed about being wrong. Scared. Marcus had been trying to reach his mother since Thursday, but all his calls went straight to voicemail. His father, Richard, claimed he didn't know where she was, saying only that she'd mentioned needing to visit her sister in Milwaukee and would be back when she was ready to talk. "Maybe she's just processing," Marcus said. but he didn't sound convinced. She was so certain about Aria not being mine. Maybe she needs time to accept that she was wrong. I shook my head. It was more than that. She said there were family things we didn't understand. What could that possibly mean? Before Marcus could answer, his phone rang. We both jumped, hoping it might be Vivienne finally ready to explain her strange behavior. Instead, it was his. Sister Claire calling from her home in Minneapolis. Marcus? Claire's voice was tight with anxiety. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Marcus put the phone on speaker and moved closer to me on the couch. What's wrong? You sound upset. Mom called me Thursday night, completely hysterical. She kept asking me weird questions about when I was born, about my early childhood, about whether I remembered anything unusual from when I was little. Then she started demanding to see my birth certificate, my medical records from when I was a baby. Marcus, what's going on? She mentioned something about Aria and DNA tests, but she wasn't making any sense. Marcus and I exchanged glances. We got the paternity results back, he said carefully. Aria is definitely my daughter. The test was 99.9% certain. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then why would Mom react like that? She should be happy, right? She should be apologizing to Isabella. That's what we thought too, I said. But she ran out of the lab like she'd seen a ghost. She kept saying there were family complications we didn't understand. Family complications, Claire repeated slowly. Marcus, there's something I need to tell you. After Mom's call, I couldn't stop thinking about her questions. So I went up to my attic and dug out some old photo albums, thinking maybe I could figure out what she was so worried about. She paused, and I could hear her taking a shaky breath. I found something weird. There are hardly any photos of me as a baby. Like, almost none. And the few baby pictures that are supposed to be me, I don't know how to explain this, but they don't look right. The baby in those photos has different features than I remember having as a toddler. Different eye color, different hair texture. My heart started beating faster. What are you saying? I'm saying I think there might be more to our family history than we've been told. And I think Mom's panic attack about your DNA results has something to do with it. Marcus was staring at the phone in shock. Claire, that's impossible. You're obviously Dad's daughter. You look exactly like him. Do I, though? I mean, I have blonde hair and blue eyes like him, but so do a lot of people. When's the last time anyone actually said I looked like Dad? Really looked at our features side by side? I was starting to understand where this was going, and it was making me feel sick. Claire, are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything yet, but I am saying that Mom's reaction to your DNA results proving Aria is Marcus's daughter doesn't make sense unless there's something about our family genetics that she doesn't want revealed. Marcus stood up and started pacing around our small living room. This is insane. You're talking about what? Adoption? Affairs? Some kind of family cover-up? I'm talking about getting answers, Claire said firmly. Marcus, I want to get my own DNA test done. I want to know for certain that Richard Hartwell is my biological father. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat. In my ears, could feel the weight of what Claire was proposing. If she wasn't Richard's biological daughter, it would explain Vivienne's terror about the DNA results. It would mean that while she was accusing me of infidelity, she was hiding her own family's secrets. Claire, Marcus said slowly, if you do this, there's no going back. If you find out something unexpected, it will change everything. Everything is already changed, she replied. Mom's behavior has made sure of that. I can't unknow what I've seen, can't unfeel how panicked she was about your test results. I need to understand why. We agreed to meet at Claire's house in Minneapolis the next day. She'd already ordered a home DNA test kit and wanted moral support while she took the sample. The drive from Cedar Falls took 2 hours, and Marcus was quiet for most of it. lost in thought about the possibility that his family wasn't what he'd always believed it to be. Claire's house was a modest two-story colonial in a quiet suburb. Nothing like the mansion she'd grown up in, but warm and welcoming in a way the Hartwell family home had never been. She greeted us at the door with red-rimmed eyes and shaking hands, clearly having slept as little as we had. "I keep thinking I'm crazy," she said as she led us into her living room. "I keep telling myself that Mom was just having some kind of breakdown about becoming a grandmother, that there's a perfectly reasonable explanation for all of this. But," I prompted, "but I can't stop thinking about how weird my childhood was. How Mom always seemed more protective of me than loving. How she never wanted me to get too close to Dad's side of the family. How she always had explanations for why I couldn't participate in certain family medical histories or genetic surveys." She showed us the photo albums she'd mentioned, and even I could see what she meant. The baby pictures were oddly sparse and seemed disconnected from the toddler photos that followed. There was something off about the timeline, gaps that didn't make sense. The DNA test kit was sitting on her coffee table, still in its packaging. Claire stared at it like it might explode. "What if I'm not his daughter?" she whispered. "What if everything I thought I knew about myself is a lie?" Marcus sat down beside his sister and took her hand. "Then we'll deal with it together, as a family. Whatever we find out, it doesn't change the fact that you're my sister and I love you." Claire opened the kit with trembling fingers and followed the instructions to collect her saliva sample. The whole process took less than 5 minutes, but it felt like we were witnessing something monumental. She sealed the sample tube and filled out the paperwork with precise, careful handwriting. "Results in 7 to 10 business days," she said, reading from the instruction sheet. "God, how am I going to get through the next week?" That's when Marcus's phone rang. We all froze when we saw Vivienne's name on the caller ID. "Should I answer it?" Marcus asked. "Yes," Claire and I said simultaneously. Marcus accepted the call and put it on speaker. "Mom, where have you been? We've been worried." Vivienne's voice sounded strained, older somehow. "I need to see you, both of you, and Isabella and the baby. There are things I need to explain, things I should have told you years ago." "What things?" Claire asked. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Claire, are you there too?" "I'm here, Mom. And I think I know what this is about." The silence stretched so long I thought the call might have been dropped. When Vivienne finally spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "What do you know?" "I know that you were terrified when Marcus's DNA test proved Aria was his daughter. I know that you've been asking me strange questions about my birth and early childhood. I know that there are hardly any baby pictures of me, and the ones that exist don't match how I looked as a toddler." Vivienne made a sound that might have been a sob. "Oh, Claire. Oh, honey. I never wanted you to find out this way. I never wanted you to find out at all." "Find out what?" Marcus demanded. "Mom, what are you talking about?" "I need to see you all in person. This isn't something I can explain over the phone. Can you come to the house? Tonight?" We agreed to meet at the Hartwell mansion at 7 o'clock. The drive back to Winnetka felt endless, filled with speculation and dread. Claire followed us in her own car, and I could see her gripping the steering wheel tightly through her rear window. The Hartwell house looked the same as always, imposing and perfectly maintained, but somehow it felt different now. Like a stage, set that had been dressed to look like a happy family home, but was hiding something darker underneath. Richard answered the door, looking older and more tired than I'd ever seen him. He hugged Claire tightly and shook Marcus's hand, but his eyes were sad and distant. "She's in the study," he said quietly. "She's been there for 3 days, going through old papers, making phone calls. I think she's finally ready to tell you the truth." We found Vivienne sitting behind Richard's massive mahogany desk, surrounded by cardboard boxes and manila folders. Her usually perfect appearance was disheveled, her makeup smudged, her clothes wrinkled. She looked up when we entered, and I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before. Genuine vulnerability. "Sit down," she said, gesturing to the chairs arranged in front of the desk. "Please." We sat in tense silence while she gathered a stack of papers from the desk. Her hands were shaking as she looked at Claire. 27 years ago, she began, her voice barely steady. "Your father and I were told we couldn't have children. We'd been trying for 5 years and the doctors said it was impossible. I was devastated. Having a family, carrying on the Hartwell name, it was everything I'd ever wanted." Claire's face had gone pale. "Mom? What are you saying?" "We decided to pursue adoption through a private agency. Very discreet, very exclusive. We wanted a baby that would fit seamlessly into our family, that would never raise questions or suspicions." The words hung in the air like poison. I felt Marcus's hand find mine and squeeze tightly. "You found a baby that looked like it could be yours," Claire said flatly. "A blonde, blue-eyed baby that would pass for a biological Hartwell." Vivienne nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "We thought we were doing the right thing. We thought it would be easier for everyone if no one ever knew the truth. So we moved away for a year, claimed I was pregnant, and when we came back, we had you." "And Marcus?" I asked, though I was starting to understand. 3 years later, we were shocked to discover I was actually pregnant. The doctors couldn't explain it, but there you were, Marcus. Our biological miracle baby. The revelation hit like a physical blow. Claire wasn't Richard's daughter. She wasn't even Vivienne's daughter. She was adopted, and her entire life had been built on a lie. "That's why you panicked about the DNA test," I said, the pieces finally clicking together. "You were afraid that, if Marcus's paternity was confirmed, someone might start asking questions about other family genetics. Someone might notice that Claire doesn't share the same genetic markers." Vivienne nodded miserably. "I've spent 27 years protecting this secret. When you got pregnant, Isabella, and the baby looked different from us, I thought. I hoped. I convinced myself that maybe she wasn't Marcus's child because it would explain the genetic differences without exposing Claire's adoption." Claire stood up abruptly, her chair falling backward. "You mean you were hoping Marcus's wife was an adulteress rather than admit that I'm adopted? You were willing to destroy their marriage to protect your lie?" "I was trying to protect you," Vivienne cried. "I was trying to protect our family." By attacking Isabella? By questioning Aria's legitimacy? By making us all feel like we didn't belong? The irony was staggering. For 3 years, Vivienne had made me feel like an outsider who didn't deserve to be part of the Hartwell family. She'd questioned my worthiness, my background, my place at their table. And all the while, she'd been hiding the fact that Claire, the daughter she'd always held up as the perfect example of a true Hartwell, wasn't even biologically related to any of them. Claire was staring at the woman she'd called mother her entire life, her face cycling through shock, anger, and betrayal. Who are my real parents? What happened to them? Vivienne pulled out a file folder and handed it to Claire with trembling hands. "Everything we know is in here. Your birth mother was a teenager who couldn't keep you. She wanted you to have a good life, a stable family. She never wanted to be contacted." Claire opened the folder and scanned the documents inside. Her birth certificate, adoption papers, medical records, the legal proof that everything she'd believed about herself was a lie. "Does Dad know?" she asked. Richard, who had been standing silently in the doorway, stepped forward. "I've known from the beginning. We made the decision together. And Claire, I want you to know that it doesn't change anything. You are my daughter in every way that matters. Biology doesn't determine love." But I could see in Claire's eyes that everything had changed for her. The foundation of her identity had just crumbled. The family she'd thought she belonged to had been living a lie her entire life. "I need some air," she said, walking toward the door. "I need to think." She left the room and we could hear the front door slam behind her. Marcus started to follow, but Richard stopped him. Let her go. She needs time to process this. I looked at Vivienne, who was slumped in her chair like a deflated balloon. For 3 years, this woman had made my life miserable, had questioned my worth, had tried to exclude me from family events and decisions. She'd attacked my character and my marriage, all to protect a secret that was far more scandalous than anything she'd accused me of. You owe Isabella an apology, Marcus said, his voice cold and hard. You owe her a massive apology. Vivienne looked up at me with red, swollen eyes. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. I was so afraid of losing everything that I was willing to sacrifice your happiness to protect my secret. It was wrong. It was cruel. I don't expect you to forgive me. I stared at her for a long moment, this woman who had tormented me for years, who was now broken and vulnerable and asking for forgiveness. Part of me wanted to gloat, to point out the hypocrisy of her accusations. But looking at her now, all I felt was pity. The damage is done, I said quietly. You can't undo 3 years of making me feel unwelcome in my own family. You can't take back the things you said about Aria, about her not belonging here. But I hope this teaches you something about making assumptions about people's worthiness. Marcus stood up and took my hand. We're going home. When you're ready to have a real conversation about how to move forward as a family, call us. But until then, stay away from my wife and daughter. As we walked out of the Hartwell mansion, carrying Aria in her car seat, I felt something I hadn't felt in 3 years. Vindicated. Not just about the paternity test, but about everything. Every slight, every criticism, every moment when Vivienne had made me feel like I didn't belong had been projection. She'd been so afraid of her own family's secrets being exposed that she'd attacked anyone who threatened the perfect image she'd worked so hard to maintain. The truth had finally come out, and it was far more damaging to the Hartwell family reputation than my working-class background had ever been. The drive home from Winnetka was silent except for the gentle hum of the car engine and Aria's occasional soft sighs from her car seat. Marcus gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw clenched as he processed everything we'd just learned. I stared out the passenger window at the familiar Illinois landscape, feeling like I was seeing everything with new eyes. For 3 years, I'd questioned myself. Every family gathering where Vivienne's smile never reached her eyes. Every backhanded compliment about my cooking or my clothes or my career choices. Every time she'd made me feel like I was somehow inferior, like I hadn't earned my place at their table. I'd internalized her criticism, wondering if maybe she was right. Maybe I wasn't sophisticated enough, educated enough, good enough for their family. Now I knew the truth. Every cruel comment, every dismissive look, every moment when she'd made me feel like an outsider had been her own guilt and fear projected onto me. She'd been so terrified of her family's secrets being exposed that she'd attacked anyone who might threaten the perfect image she'd spent decades constructing. I can't believe it, Marcus said finally as we pulled into our apartment complex parking lot. My whole life, Claire was held up as the perfect Hartwell child, the one who looked right, acted right, fit the family image, and she's not even biologically related to any of you, I finished. While I've been made to feel like I don't belong because I'm Latina and from a working-class family. Marcus turned off the engine and sat back in his seat, running his hands through his hair. I'm so sorry, Izzy. I'm sorry I ever doubted you, even for a second. I'm sorry I let my mother's poison get into my head. I'm sorry I didn't defend you. Better all these years. I reached over and took his hand. You defended me tonight. You stood up to her when it mattered most. I should have done it years ago. I should have seen what she was doing to you. We sat in the car for a few more minutes, both of us trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. Aria was sleeping peacefully in her car seat, completely unaware that her grandmother's world had just imploded around us. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we go upstairs, and we start living our lives without constantly worrying about my mother's approval," Marcus said firmly. "Now we raise our daughter in a home where she's loved and wanted, and never made to feel like she has to prove her worth." As we carried Aria upstairs to our apartment, I felt something lifting from my shoulders. A weight I'd been carrying for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to be without it. For the first time since I'd married into the Hartwell family, I felt like I truly belonged somewhere. Over the next few days, the ripple effects of Vivienne's confession began to spread through the extended family. Marcus fielded calls from confused relatives who'd heard whispers of some kind of family crisis, but didn't understand what was happening. He told them the truth, simply and directly. Claire was adopted, and the family had kept it secret for 27 years. The reactions were mixed. Some relatives were shocked and hurt that they'd been lied to for so long. Others were understanding, saying that adoption was nothing to be ashamed of, and they couldn't understand why it had been kept secret. A few pointed out that they'd always suspected something was different about the family dynamics, but had never been able to put their finger on what it was. Richard called Tuesday evening to check on us and to apologize again for Vivienne's behavior. His voice sounded hollow, defeated. "How is she?" Marcus asked. "Not good. She hasn't left her room since Sunday night. She keeps saying she's destroyed everything, that the family will never forgive her for the lies." "And Claire?" "She's not taking my calls. I drove to Minneapolis yesterday, but she wouldn't see me. I understand she needs time, but—" His voice broke slightly. "I'm afraid I've lost my daughter." I felt a pang of sympathy for Richard. Whatever mistakes he'd made in keeping the adoption secret, it was clear that his love for Claire was genuine. But I also understood Claire's need for space. Learning that your entire identity was built on lies couldn't be easy to process. "Give her time," Marcus said. "She'll come around. But Dad, things can't go back to the way they were. Too much has happened." "I know. Your mother knows that too. She's talking about getting professional help, therapy to deal with why she felt the need to build all these walls to attack people who threatened her carefully constructed image." It was the first time in my marriage that I'd heard Richard acknowledge that Vivienne's behavior toward me had been wrong. The first time anyone in the family had suggested that maybe, just maybe, the problem hadn't been with me. Thursday afternoon, I was feeding Aria in the nursery when my phone rang. I was surprised to see Claire's name on the caller ID. "Isabella?" Her voice was hoarse, like she'd been crying for days. "Claire, how are you? We've been worried about you. I'm processing. I've been driving around Minneapolis for 3 days, just thinking." I went to the adoption agency Mom mentioned, talked to a counselor there about what it's like for adult adoptees when they find out the truth. "What did they tell you?" "That it's normal to feel like your whole life has been a lie. That it's normal to be angry, confused, to question everything you thought you knew about yourself. But they also said that biology doesn't determine family, that the people who raised you and loved you are still your family, even if they made mistakes." I could hear her taking shaky breaths on the other end of the line. "Isabella, I need to apologize to you. All these years, I watched Mom treat you like you didn't belong, and I never said anything. I told myself it wasn't my business, that it was between you and her. But I should have stood up for you. I should have seen that her behavior was wrong. Claire, you don't need to—" "Yes, I do. Because now I understand what it feels like to have your place in the family questioned. I understand what it's like to feel like you don't really belong. And I'm so sorry you had to live with that for 3 years." Tears welled up in my eyes. This was the first time anyone in the Hartwell family besides Marcus had acknowledged what I'd been going through. The first time someone had validated my experience instead of telling me I was being too sensitive or imagining things. "Thank you," I whispered. "That means more than you know." I want to see you and Marcus and Aria. Not at Mom and Dad's house, not with all that history and baggage. Maybe you could come here? Or we could meet somewhere neutral. We agreed to meet at a family restaurant in Cedar Falls on Saturday afternoon. When Claire walked in, she looked different somehow. Smaller, more uncertain, but also more real than I'd ever seen her. The perfect Hartwell composure was gone, replaced by something more human and vulnerable. She hugged Marcus tightly, then turned to me. We'd never been physically affectionate before. Vivienne had always discouraged displays of emotion. But Claire pulled me into a genuine hug that lasted longer than any we'd ever shared. "Can I hold her?" she asked, looking down at Aria, with wonder. I handed my daughter to her sister-in-law, watching as Claire's face softened. "Hi, beautiful girl," she whispered. "I'm your Aunt Claire. I know I haven't been the best aunt so far, but I promise I'm going to do better." Aria looked up at Claire with those dark brown eyes that had caused so much controversy, and Claire smiled for the first time since the revelation. "She's perfect," Claire said. "Absolutely perfect, and anyone who can't see that is blind." We talked, for hours that afternoon. Claire shared what she'd learned about her birth parents from the adoption files. Her birth mother had been 17, an honor student who'd gotten pregnant and couldn't keep the baby. She'd specifically requested a family that could provide education and opportunities she couldn't offer. "She wanted me to have a good life," Claire said. "And despite everything, despite the lies and the secrets, I did have a good life. Richard and Vivienne love me. They made mistakes, huge ones, but they tried to give me everything they thought I needed." "But," Marcus prompted, "but I need time to figure out who I am now. Who Claire is when she's not trying to be the perfect Hartwell daughter. I've spent my whole life unconsciously trying to prove I belonged in this family, and now I find out I was right to feel like I had to prove it." She looked at me across the table. "I think that's part of why Mom was so hard on you. You represented everything she was afraid of. Someone who was obviously different, who didn't fit the image she'd worked so hard to maintain. She saw you as a threat to the perfect family picture she'd constructed to hide the truth about me. So she tried to make me feel like I was the one who didn't belong," I said. "Exactly. And I'm so sorry I let that happen. I'm so sorry I didn't recognize what was happening and speak up." That evening, Marcus and I put Aria to bed together, something that felt more peaceful and natural than it had since she was born. The cloud of doubt and suspicion that had been hanging over our family was finally lifting. "I feel different," I told Marcus as we stood looking down at our sleeping daughter. "Lighter somehow. You should. You've been vindicated in the most spectacular way possible. Mom spent 3 years making you feel like you weren't good enough for our family, and it turns out she was hiding secrets that were far more scandalous than anything she ever accused you of." "It's not about the scandal," I said. "It's about the truth. For the first time since I married you, I feel like I can be myself without constantly worrying about whether I'm measuring up to some impossible standard." Marcus pulled me close. "I'm going to make sure you never have to worry about that again. Our daughter is going to grow up knowing she's loved exactly as she is, that she doesn't have to prove her worth to anyone." The next week, we received a long handwritten letter from Vivienne. In it, she apologized again for her behavior and acknowledged the damage she'd caused to our marriage and our family. She wrote about her fears, her need for control, and her recognition that she'd nearly destroyed the very thing she'd been trying to protect. "I spent so much energy trying to maintain a perfect image that I forgot what actually makes a family perfect," she wrote. "It's not bloodlines or social status or keeping up appearances. It's love, acceptance, and treating each other with kindness and respect. I failed at that spectacularly, and I'm deeply sorry." She also wrote that she was beginning therapy to understand why she'd felt the need to build such walls, why she'd been so threatened by anything that didn't fit her narrow vision of family perfection. "I don't expect immediate forgiveness," the letter concluded. "But I hope that someday when you're ready, We can try to build a real relationship. One based on honesty instead of pretense, on love instead of judgment." I read the letter twice, then handed it to Marcus. "What do you think?" he asked. "I think it's a start," I said. "But words are easy. The real test will be whether she can actually change her behavior, whether she can learn to treat people with the respect they deserve regardless of whether they fit her expectations." That night, as I nursed Aria in our bedroom, I thought about the journey we'd all been on. The pain, the doubt, the accusations, and finally, the truth. For months, I'd felt like I was fighting a battle I couldn't win, defending myself against accusations I didn't understand. Now I realized I hadn't just won the battle. I'd exposed the hypocrisy that had created it in the first place. Vivienne's attack on my character had backfired spectacularly, revealing secrets that demolished the very foundation of superiority she'd used to judge me. As I looked down at Aria's peaceful face, I made her a silent promise. She would never have to prove her worth to anyone. She would grow up knowing that she was loved unconditionally, that her value didn't depend on meeting other people's expectations or fitting into their narrow definitions of what was acceptable. She would know that sometimes the people who judge you the harshest are the ones with the most to hide, and she would know that the truth, no matter how painful it might be in the moment, is always better than living a lie. 6 months after the truth came out, I stood in the same nursery where I'd once whispered desperate apologies to my newborn daughter for the chaos surrounding her birth. But now, as I watched 8-month-old Aria pull herself up in her crib, babbling happily at her mobile, everything felt different. The weight of constantly proving myself worthy had lifted, replaced by something I'd never experienced in my marriage before: genuine peace. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. There had been difficult conversations, painful reckonings, and slow rebuilding of trust. But gradually, our family had begun to heal in ways I never thought possible. Vivienne had been true to her word about therapy. She'd been seeing Dr. Margaret Hoffman, a family counselor who specialized in issues of control and perfectionism, twice a week for months. The change in her was subtle but unmistakable. She asked permission before visiting instead of showing up unannounced. She complimented my cooking without suggesting improvements. Most importantly, she looked at Aria with genuine love instead of genetic analysis. "The work isn't easy," she'd told me during one of our carefully supervised visits. "Dr. Hoffman is helping me understand why I felt such a desperate need to control everything, why I saw differences as threats instead of gifts. It's humbling to realize how much damage I caused in the name of protecting my family." Richard had been attending some of the therapy sessions with her, working through his own guilt about enabling decades of deception. He'd started reaching out to me independently, asking about my work, my background, my family in ways he'd never bothered to do before. It was awkward at first, but gradually we'd found common ground in our shared love for Marcus and Aria. The biggest challenge had been Claire's journey. After weeks of soul-searching, she'd decided to reach out to her birth mother through the adoption agency. It had taken months of counseling and mediation, but they'd finally met in November. Claire had described it as simultaneously the most terrifying and healing experience of her life. "She's nothing like I imagined," Claire had told us afterward, her eyes bright with tears. "She's a nurse now, married with 2 kids. She never forgot about me. Never stopped wondering if she'd made the right choice. When she saw me, the first thing she said was, 'You're beautiful, and you look happy. That's all I ever wanted for you.'" Claire had chosen to maintain relationships with both families, introducing her birth mother, Sarah, to Richard and Vivienne in a series of careful, supervised meetings. It had been awkward and emotional, but something beautiful had emerged from it. Claire now had a broader definition of family, one that included both the parents who'd raised her and the woman who'd given her life. "I understand now why Mom was so afraid," Claire had reflected during one of our family dinners. She thought that if I found out about Sarah, I'd reject her and Dad. She couldn't imagine that love isn't a finite resource, that having more people care about you doesn't diminish the love you have for the people who raised you. The ripple effects of honesty had spread through our entire extended family. Cousins who'd always felt pressure to maintain perfect appearances began sharing their own struggles and imperfections. Family gatherings became more relaxed, more genuine. The Hartwell family's perfect facade had cracked, but what emerged was something more real and ultimately more beautiful. Marcus had changed too. The man who'd once tried to mediate between his mother's expectations and his wife's feelings had found his voice as a husband and father. He'd set clear boundaries with his parents about their involvement in our lives and decision-making about Aria. But more than that, he'd begun to understand how his own privilege had blinded him to the struggles I'd faced. I grew up thinking that if people just worked hard and were good people, they'd be accepted, he'd told me one evening as we cleaned up after dinner. I didn't understand that some people have to prove their worth in ways others never do. I didn't see how exhausting it was for you to constantly feel like you were being tested. One of the most unexpected developments had been my relationship with my own family. For years, I'd been so focused on trying to fit into the Hartwell world that I'd unconsciously distanced myself from my roots. My mother, Elena, had watched from the sidelines as I struggled to gain acceptance from people who seemed determined not to accept me. "Mija," she'd said to me in Spanish during one of our weekly phone calls, "you spent so much time trying to become someone you thought they wanted you to be, but you were always enough, exactly as you were." She was right. Trying to prove myself worthy of the Hartwell name, I'd lost sight of the strength and resilience that had gotten me to Northwestern, that had helped me build a career helping immigrant families navigate complex systems, that had carried me through a difficult pregnancy and traumatic birth. Now, at Aria's 8-month birthday celebration, our living room was filled with a strange but wonderful mix of people. My mother sat next to Richard, showing him photos of her garden and laughing at his attempts to speak Spanish. Claire was on the floor with Aria, speaking to her in both English and the few words of Spanish she'd been learning. Marcus was in the kitchen with my cousin Raphael, getting a cooking lesson in authentic tamales. And Vivienne was there too, sitting quietly in the corner, watching the controlled chaos with something that looked like wonder. This wasn't the kind of gathering she would have planned or approved of 6 months ago. It was loud, bilingual, informal, and completely imperfect. But it was also full of genuine love and acceptance in ways her carefully orchestrated dinner parties had never been. "Isabella," she'd approached me as I was refilling drinks. "Thank you for including me today. I know I don't deserve to be here after everything I put you through." "You're here because Aria deserves to know all her family," I'd replied. "And because people can change if they're willing to do the work." She'd nodded, tears in her eyes. "I'm learning that controlling people isn't the same thing as loving them. Dr. Hoffman says I spent so much energy trying to manage everyone's image that I forgot to actually connect with them as people." Later that evening, after everyone had gone home and Aria was asleep, Marcus and I sat on our couch, surrounded by wrapping paper and the remnants of cake. Our small apartment felt full of love in a way the Hartwell mansion never had. "Do you think she'll remember any of this?" Marcus asked, nodding toward the nursery. "The accusations, the tension, the drama? I hope not," I said. "But even if she does, she'll also remember how we fought for her, how we didn't let anyone diminish her worth or question her place in our family." I thought about the little girl sleeping in the next room, the one whose existence had exposed decades of family secrets and forced everyone to confront uncomfortable truths. Aria would grow up knowing that families are complicated, that people make mistakes, but that love and honesty can heal even the deepest wounds. She would also grow up knowing her own worth, not because of her last name or her genetic heritage, but because she was loved fiercely and unconditionally by parents who would never let anyone make her feel like she had to prove her right to exist. A year later, I started writing about our experience. Not for publication initially, just for myself, trying to process everything we'd been through. But as I wrote, I realized that our story wasn't unique. Thousands of women deal with difficult in-laws, face accusations about their worthiness, struggle to find their place in families that don't immediately welcome them. I began sharing parts of our story on social media, and the response was overwhelming. Women from all backgrounds reached out to share their own experiences of feeling judged, dismissed, or questioned by their partners' families. Many had similar stories of being made to feel like outsiders in their own lives. "Your story gave me hope," one woman wrote. "I've been dealing with a mother-in-law who questions everything I do, from how I parent to how I manage our finances. Reading about how you stood your ground and eventually found peace helps me believe that things can get better." Another message said, "I'm an adoptee who just found out the truth about my origins. Your story about Claire helped me understand that I'm not alone in feeling like my whole identity has been shaken. Thank you for showing that families can rebuild after devastating revelations." These connections led to speaking opportunities at family counseling centers and adoption support groups. I found myself becoming an advocate for honesty in family relationships, for the courage to confront uncomfortable truths rather than hiding behind perfect facades. The irony wasn't lost on me that Vivienne's attempts to silence and diminish me had ultimately given me a platform and a voice I might never have found otherwise. Her accusations had backfired so spectacularly that they'd exposed not just her own hypocrisy, but the broader issues facing families struggling with acceptance and belonging. 3 years after that devastating afternoon, when Vivienne first questioned Aria's legitimacy, our daughter took her first steps. She toddled across our living room, which was now decorated with family photos that told the real story of who we were. Pictures of my mother holding Aria, of Claire teaching her to clap, of Richard reading her bedtime stories. Photos that showed a family that looked nothing like the perfect Hartwell image, but was bound together by something much stronger than genetics or social status. As I write this, Aria is 4 years old, bilingual, confident, and completely secure in her place in our complicated but loving family. She calls my mother Abuela Elena and Vivienne Grandma Viv. She knows that families come in all shapes and sizes, that love isn't limited by biology, and that the truth is always better than pretty lies. When people ask me about forgiveness, whether I've truly forgiven Vivienne for the pain she caused, I tell them that forgiveness isn't a destination, it's a daily choice. Some days it's easier than others. But I've learned that holding on to anger only gives the people who hurt you continued power over your life. Vivienne still isn't perfect. She still sometimes catches herself making judgmental comments or trying to control situations. But now she apologizes, corrects herself, and does better the next time. That's all any of us can do. If you're reading this and you recognize yourself in my story, if you're feeling like you don't belong in your own life, if someone is making you question your worth or your place in their family, know this: you belong wherever you are loved. You don't have to prove your worthiness to anyone. Your value isn't determined by other people's approval or their narrow definitions of what's acceptable. Sometimes the people who judge us the harshest are fighting their own battles with truth and authenticity. Sometimes their attacks on us are really projections of their own insecurities and fears. But that doesn't excuse the damage they cause, and you don't have to accept being diminished to make them feel better about themselves. Stand your ground, demand respect, protect your children from toxic dynamics, and remember that the truth, even when it's messy and uncomfortable and nothing like the perfect picture you thought you were part of, is always better than living a lie. Your story matters. Your voice matters, and no one else gets to write the narrative of your worth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.